The morning fog hung thick over the French countryside on December 19, 1944, when a veteran Tiger commander received the order that would seal his fate. Standing in the commander's cupola of his Tiger tank, he watched as dozens more of these mechanical monsters rumbled into formation around him. Each one weighed 56 tons. Each one carried an 88mm gun that could punch through American armor like a fist through paper. Each one cost as much as a small factory to build. And somewhere beyond those frost-covered hills, George S. Patton was coming. The commander had been fighting since Poland. He'd seen the unstoppable advance through France in 1940, the frozen hell of the Russian front, and now this desperate winter in the Ardennes. He knew what his Tiger could do. In Russia, he'd seen entire Soviet tank companies destroyed in single engagements. The Tiger's armor was over 3 inches thick at its strongest points. American Shermans were tin cans by comparison. On paper, Germany's heavy tank battalions should have been an unbreakable wall of steel. But he also knew something else. He knew about the man they were being sent to stop. George Patton didn't fight by the book. He didn't wait for perfect conditions or overwhelming odds. He attacked when you thought he couldn't, from directions you didn't expect, with a speed that left you gasping. The other American generals were cautious, methodical. Patton was something different. He was a storm given human form, profane and brilliant and absolutely relentless. When Hitler launched Operation Watch on the Rhine, the plan seemed perfect. Catch the Americans by surprise. Punch through their weakest point in the Ardennes forest. Drive all the way to Antwerp and split the Allied armies in half. Destroy them before they could recover. Maybe, just maybe, force a negotiated peace that would let Germany survive. The attack began on December 16th, and for the first few days, it worked. American positions crumbled. Entire units surrendered or retreated in chaos. The weather was so bad that Allied planes couldn't fly, which meant German armor could move without being bombed into scrap. Within 48 hours, the Wehrmacht had created a bulge in the American lines 30 miles deep. Up north, towns fell like dominoes. At a crossroads called Bastogne, the 101st Airborne was completely surrounded. The situation looked desperate. And that's when someone suggested the impossible. Turn Patton's entire Third Army 90 degrees north and send them to break the siege. Dwight Eisenhower, the supreme Allied commander, called his generals together at Verdun on the 19th. The room was tense. The German offensive had shocked everyone. Some wanted to retreat and regroup. Others argued for a cautious counterattack in 2 or 3 weeks. Patton walked in late, as usual. He listened for maybe 5 minutes. Then Eisenhower turned to him and asked how soon he could attack. On December 22nd, Patton said, with 3 divisions. The room went silent. What Patton was proposing was crazy. His Third Army was fighting in the Saar region, facing east. To attack north into the bulge, he'd have to disengage from combat, turn nearly 250,000 men and thousands of vehicles 90 degrees, move them 100 miles through ice and snow, and coordinate a massive assault. All in 72 hours. In good weather, with time to plan, it would have been difficult. In the middle of winter, in the middle of a crisis, it should have been impossible. But Eisenhower knew his man. He knew Patton had already drawn up plans for exactly this scenario, just in case. He knew that while other generals saw obstacles, Patton saw opportunities. "Get moving," Eisenhower said. And the machine began to turn. Back in the Ardennes, Germany's remaining heavy tank battalions, including the feared Tigers, were being positioned to make sure Patton never reached Bastogne. The German commanders knew that if the Americans could relieve the surrounded paratroopers, the entire offensive might stall. They needed to hold Patton back long enough for other German forces to take Bastogne and keep driving west. Tigers were precious. Germany was running out of everything by late 1944. Fuel, ammunition, trained crews, spare parts. Each Tiger represented an enormous investment of scarce resources. But this was the moment to use them. If the Ardennes offensive failed, there would be no recovery. The Reich was fighting for survival now. The plan was to position the heavy tanks in a defensive line south of Bastogne, across the routes Patton would have to use. Let him come. Let those fast-moving American columns run straight into concentrated Tiger fire. Kill the Shermans, stall the advance, win time. What the German planners didn't fully appreciate was what Patton had created. The Third Army wasn't just another military formation. It was an extension of one man's will, trained and honed to fight the way he wanted to fight. Fast. Aggressive. Never stopping. On December 22nd, exactly when Patton had promised, his tanks attacked. They didn't come the way the Germans expected. Patton didn't send his armor straight up the main roads where the Tigers waited. He sent them through forests and farm tracks that were barely on the maps. When they hit resistance, they didn't slow down to reduce it. They went around it. Combat engineers moved with the lead tanks, clearing obstacles while the columns were still rolling. Artillery fired constantly, not at specific targets but at map coordinates, suppressing anything that might slow the advance. The first Tigers to make contact opened fire at long range, the way they were trained. The 88mm gun was accurate out to 2,000 yards. Hit a Sherman at that distance and you'd blow the turret clean off. But the American columns weren't obliging the Tigers by driving straight at them. They were spreading out, using smoke, coming from multiple directions at once. One Tiger commander fired his first shot of the battle at a Sherman he spotted moving between two farmhouses. The armor-piercing round covered the distance in less than a second. Direct hit. The Sherman exploded, ammunition cooking off inside. But even as the loader was ramming another shell into the breach, 3 more Shermans were firing back. The Americans had learned not to fight Tigers one-on-one. 3 or 4 Shermans would engage a single Tiger from different angles. Most of their shells would bounce off that thick armor, but they only needed one to find a weak spot. The lower front plate. The engine deck. The cupola. And while the Tiger was turning its turret to deal with one target, another Sherman was flanking. But it wasn't just the tanks. Patton had integrated everything. As one Tiger destroyed its third Sherman, American fighter bombers appeared overhead. The weather had cleared enough for them to fly, and they came in waves. P-47 Thunderbolts with rockets under their wings, hunting for German armor. A Tiger could survive most things, but a rocket or bomb hitting the thin top armor was fatal. Tiger after Tiger brewed up within minutes, hit from above. The crews that made it out were cut down by machine gun fire from American infantry that seemed to be everywhere. The German doctrine was to hold ground. Make the Americans come to you. Use the Tiger's superior gun and armor. But Patton's forces weren't trying to hold ground. They were trying to move. And every hour the Tigers delayed them was an hour the defenders at Bastogne had to hold on. By the second day of fighting, the German heavy tank formations had been reduced by half. Not all destroyed, some had simply broken down. The Tiger was a magnificent weapon but also a mechanical nightmare. It needed constant maintenance, replacement parts, skilled mechanics. In the chaos of the battle, tanks threw tracks, engines overheated, transmissions failed. And once a Tiger couldn't move, it became a very expensive pillbox. Worse, they were running out of fuel. Each Tiger consumed fuel at a prodigious rate. The German logistics system, already stretched thin, couldn't keep up. Some Tigers were abandoned with their guns still working, simply because there was no fuel to move them. The Americans kept coming. Patton was on the radio constantly, demanding speed. When a unit reported they were taking heavy fire, he'd tell them to bypass it and keep moving. When someone said the roads were too bad, he'd curse them out and tell them to use the ditches. When his staff suggested pausing to consolidate, he'd slam his fist on the map and shout that the men in Bastogne didn't have the luxury of pausing. On Christmas Eve, one Tiger was down to its last few shells. The company that had started with 12 tanks was down to 3. Positioned on a ridge overlooking a snow-covered valley, the commander saw them. American tanks, dozens of them, with white stars painted on their sides, moving in a column that stretched back to the horizon. He could have run, could have pulled back, tried to save his tank and his crew. But he'd been given an order. Stop Patton. So he loaded his second-to-last armor-piercing round and waited for them to get closer. The lead Sherman never saw the Tiger. The shot took it through the glassy plate at 800 yards. But before the loader could chamber the last shell, the entire American column was firing back. Not at where the Tiger was, but at every possible position it could be firing from. The hilltop disappeared in explosions. The Tiger took 3 hits in quick succession. One bounced off the turret. One penetrated the lower hull. The third went through the engine compartment and the tank filled with smoke. The crew got out, all except the driver who was already dead from the second hit. They ran through the snow with American bullets kicking up dirt around them. From the trees, they watched the Shermans roll past the burning Tiger without stopping. They just kept going. Always moving. That was Patton's secret. Don't fight every battle. Don't get bogged down. Just keep moving toward the objective. On December 26th, lead elements of Patton's 4th Armored Division broke through to Bastogne. The siege was over. The German offensive, which had started with such promise, began to collapse. Of the heavy tank battalions sent to stop Patton, only a fraction made it back to German lines. The rest were destroyed in combat, abandoned due to mechanical failure, or captured when they ran out of fuel. Their crews, the elite of the panzer forces, were killed, wounded, or taken prisoner. It was one of the most devastating losses suffered by Germany's heavy tank units in the West. Each Tiger represented millions of Reichsmarks, thousands of man-hours, precious materials that Germany couldn't replace. But more than that, they represented a kind of warfare that was already obsolete. The Germans fought the way they'd been taught. Use superior weapons. Hold strong positions. Make the enemy come to you and bleed them. It had worked in 1940. It had worked for a while in Russia. But Patton had figured out something different. Superior weapons didn't matter if you could be outmaneuvered. Strong positions didn't matter if the enemy just went around them. Even the best tank in the world was just a hunk of metal if it couldn't move, couldn't be repaired, couldn't be fueled. Patton won not because he had better equipment. The Tiger was absolutely a better tank than the Sherman. He won because he understood that modern war was about systems, not weapons. Logistics, air support, combined arms, speed, flexibility, the willingness to take risks and keep pushing even when things looked bad. After the war, military historians studied what happened in the Ardennes. They analyzed the tactics, the decisions, the mistakes on both sides. And they kept coming back to one conclusion. The Germans had bet everything on a single desperate throw of the dice. They'd committed their best forces, used their best equipment, chosen the time and place for the attack. And it hadn't been enough. Not because the German soldiers fought poorly. They fought with skill and courage. Not because the German equipment was inferior. The Tiger, the Panther, the 88mm gun were all superb weapons. They lost because Patton moved faster than they could react, hit harder than they could absorb, and never, ever stopped coming. One Tiger commander survived the war. He spent 2 years in a prisoner of war camp, then went home to a Germany that didn't exist anymore. Years later, when people asked him about the Ardennes, he'd talk about the cold, the chaos, the friends he'd lost. But he'd also talk about the moment he watched those American Shermans roll past his burning Tiger without even slowing down. "That's when I knew we'd lost," he'd say. "Not the war. I knew that already. But that moment, watching them just keep going like nothing could stop them. That's when I understood. We were fighting with the best weapons. But they were fighting a different kind of war." The heavy tank battalions sent to stop Patton were the pride of the panzer forces. Each Tiger could have destroyed a dozen Shermans in a fair fight. But Patton didn't fight fair. He fought to win. And in the frozen forests of the Ardennes, against an enemy that refused to stop, even the mighty Tiger tank learned that sometimes the best weapon in the world isn't enough. The Battle of the Bulge raged for another month after Bastogne was relieved. But the outcome was never really in doubt after Patton's breakthrough. The Germans had shot their last bolt. After the Ardennes, they'd never again launch an offensive in the West. It was retreat, defense, and final defeat. For the American veterans who fought there, the memory never faded. The cold that froze weapons and frostbit fingers. The white landscape that turned red. The sound of Tiger 88s and the prayer that the shot would miss. But also the memory of a general who believed in them, who asked the impossible and got it, who turned an army on a dime and drove it through the teeth of the German offensive like an armored fist. Patton died in a car accident 7 months after Germany surrendered, never making it home to the retirement and peace he'd earned. But in those frozen December days, leading his Third Army north to Bastogne, he created something that would be studied and remembered for generations. Not just a military victory, but a masterclass in leadership, speed, and the aggressive spirit that wins wars. The Tigers were magnificent machines. But machines don't win wars. People do. And in the winter of 1944, the people of the Third Army, led by a general who refused to accept the impossible, proved that courage and speed and relentless determination could overcome even the best weapons the enemy had. The iron graveyard south of Bastogne, where those Tigers burned and rusted, stood as a monument to that truth for years after the war. Eventually the wrecks were cleared away, melted down, turned into tractors and cars and peaceful things.